Okay, so you know how sometimes you kind of stumble across a story and you're like, wait a minute, I had no idea that this was such a big deal.
Totally. I mean, think about it like this, right? You have this whole narrative that we sort of inherited.
And it flips everything you thought you knew upside down.
Yeah, and I think that's what happened when we started digging into these sources you sent us on the Silk Road.
Totally. I mean, forget this idea of just a simple trade route. I mean, we're talking about the central nervous
It's
system
for empires, for ideas.
for so much of what shapes our world today, even.
And I think what's fascinating is that your sources really kind of hit on this, like how this traditional Eurocentric view of history kind of misses the point, right?
Yeah. And I feel like I'm constantly being reminded how much of my perspective is shaped by, you know, growing up here in the West.
Yeah, like we think of Europe as the center stage.
Right. Like it's always been the main player.
But then you look at these maps, right? Like
Hmm.
these medieval maps, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, or even these Arab and Turkish maps that were being made centuries ago.
And they put Jerusalem smack dab in the middle, or sometimes even this city I'd never even heard of called Balas Lagoon.
And suddenly Europe is just like way off on the edge.
Yeah, it's like someone just shifted the entire map.
And that's exactly what happened. The center of the world wasn't fixed. It was all about who was drawing the map.
And for a huge chunk of history, that center was right in the heart of the Silk Road's domain.
Exactly. And I think what's important to remember is that this wasn't just some overnight phenomenon.
Right. It's not like someone just flipped a switch and suddenly the Silk Road appeared.
It was centuries in the making, with connections forming even before we had this formal idea of a Silk Road.
Yeah, like that myth of Dionysus traveling all the way to Greece from this fabulously wealthy East. I mean, it already shows you that there was this long history of interaction.
And this perception of the East as a place of riches and wonder, right?
Totally. And it's not like they were just totally isolated societies.
Right, there were always connections, even if they seem fragile to us now.
Okay, but then comes Alexander the Great. I mean, we all know about his conquests, but the sources really focus on how they physically linked this massive territory.
It's about creating this contiguous space for communication and the exchange of ideas.
Yeah, stretching from Asia Minor through Central Asia, all along that ancient Persian royal road. I mean, that's a huge swath of land.
And that really laid the groundwork for the Silk Road to flourish centuries later.
And it wasn't just about conquering territory, right? The descriptions of these cities surrendering like Babylon with flowers strewn on the roads and gifts of lions and leopards. I mean,
It speaks to this incredible concentration of wealth and power in these eastern lands.
yeah, it gives you a sense of the scale and the grandeur of it all.
And the fact that Alexander was able to physically connect these regions opened up so many possibilities.
But it wasn't just armies and empires moving around, right? The
Yeah.
sources make a big point about this two-way flow of influence.
Yeah, the exchange of ideas, cultural motifs, religious practices, it went both ways.
Like the suggestion that ancient Indian texts might have influenced the Aeneid. I mean, that just blew my mind.
It makes you question everything you thought you knew about the origins of Western literature.
And then you have these incredible finds like the Tilla Tepe graves in Afghanistan with Greek artistic styles mixed with influences from Siberia and India.
It's this amazing visual representation of this early cultural fusion.
Yeah, like even back then, cultures weren't these isolated things.
They were constantly interacting, borrowing, blending.
It's like this early form of globalization.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway from this whole exploration of the early Silk Road.
Yeah.
It was never just about trade.
Okay, so we've got this amazing cultural tapestry being woven, but there's another crucial element that the sources highlight: the nomadic tribes.
Right, like the Yuezhi and the
And
Xiongnu.
I have to admit, I always just pictured them as raiders, these barbarian hordes sweeping across the steppes.
Yeah, that's the common image,
Okay.
but it's far more complex than that.
Totally. They were also essential trading partners, especially for livestock.
And horses,
Oh, yeah, those horses from Xinjiang, those were like the Ferraris of the ancient world.
right, especially for the Chinese who needed them for their military.
So this relationship between the settled agricultural societies and the nomads, it wasn't just about conflict.
It was also about interdependence,
Each side needed what the other had.
and that created the basis for exchange.
Okay, so let's talk about this tributary system between China and the Xiongnu, because it's fascinating, right?
Yeah, you have this nomadic tribe
Hmm.
that contemporary Chinese counts often described as barbaric.
Right, and yet they're receiving all these luxury goods from China, silk rice wine,
It's like this exchange for peace.
which really highlights how important silk was right from the beginning.
It wasn't just a commodity, it was a symbol of power, a diplomatic tool.
And this tributary system, it created this formal framework for interaction.
Where the Xiongnu received these gifts in return for nominal acknowledgement of Chinese authority and, more importantly, peace.
Right, so it fostered this economic relationship, even though on the surface it looks like an unequal power dynamic.
And the Xiongnu valued silk, both for its practical uses and as a marker of status.
Which fueled production within China and gave silk this central role in these early trade networks.
And then you have the Romans entering the picture.
Oh yeah, big time. And they really get involved with India after they take over Egypt.
And the sources describe this explosion of Roman trade with India.
I mean, 120 ships a year sailing to India, that's a lot of boats.
And it's not just about the number of ships, it's the volume of goods being exchanged.
Right, there are all these Roman artifacts and coins found in India, amphorae lamps, mirrors, statues, you name it.
It suggests this really substantial economic link.
Some historians even think that Roman currency might have been used locally in parts of India.
And all of this was driven by Roman demand for Eastern luxury goods.
Right. Rome was getting wealthy and they wanted all the cool stuff, spices, precious stones, silks, you name it.
And India was a prime source for all of these exotic goods.
Yeah. And the Romans, they weren't shy about showing off their wealth.
Oh no, they love to flaunt it.
Like that crazy dinner party described in Petronius' Satyricon Trimalchio's feast.
Yeah, with live birds sewn into a pig and peacock on the table. I mean, talk about extravagant.
It gives you a real sense of the tastes and the excess that was driving this long-distance trade.
It wasn't just about acquiring necessities. It was about conspicuous consumption.
Showing off your status through these rare and unusual goods.
And it's interesting that Rome's direct interaction with the Far East was limited.
Yeah, they were more focused on Persia.
Which makes sense. Persia was their main rival and a potential target for conquest.
But even though Rome wasn't directly trading with China, their obsession with Persia indirectly impacted the East-West dynamic.
Because all the regions along the routes leading to Persia gained strategic and economic importance.
It's like this ripple effect, right? Rome's focus on Persia indirectly boosted trade along the Silk Road.
Exactly. And even Rome's ambition to control what they saw as the heart of the world by pushing into Persian territory shows their eastward orientation.
Okay, so we've talked about the material stuff, the goods, the empires, the wealth, but the Silk Road wasn't just about that, was it?
Oh no, not at all.
It was also this incredible melting pot of ideas and religions.
It was a conduit for knowledge and faith.
You had all these different beliefs: Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Manichaeism, and so many others, all interacting, vying for influence.
And political power was often linked to this idea of divine favor.
Right, so rulers would use religion to legitimize their rule.
And this created this dynamic and vibrant religious landscape.
Yeah, with different faiths spreading along these trade routes and interacting with each other.
Sometimes clashing, sometimes blending, sometimes coexisting.
And for this whole system of commercial and religious exchange to really work, you needed these reliable starting points.
Places where travelers could rest, resupply, and find spiritual comfort.
And the Sogdians, they seem to have played a crucial role here.
Oh, absolutely. They were like the masters of the Silk Road.
And their adoption of Buddhism really helped it spread eastward.
You see evidence of this everywhere. Those stupas and travelers' inscriptions in the Huns Valley, the massive Buddhist monasteries around Kabul.
It shows you how these monasteries were more than just religious centers.
They were hubs of culture and commerce, offering shelter, sustenance, and spiritual guidance.
Okay, so promoting one religion could have unintended consequences, right?
Right, like the sources talk about how Zoroastrianism became so closely tied to the Persian Empire.
That some people in the border regions started looking to Christianity as an alternative.
It's like they were pushing back against Persian dominance by adopting a different faith.
So religion could be a tool of resistance almost.
Absolutely. It was a way to express a distinct cultural identity.
And then you have the Roman Empire adopting Christianity, which really complicates things with Persia.
Yeah, the Persian rulers saw this as a threat.
They thought Christians within their empire might be loyal to Rome.
So they started persecuting Christians.
And it shows you how these global connections could have these really serious consequences.
Religion and politics were always intertwined. And when those two forces clashed, it could lead to violence and persecution.
And on top of all of this, you had these nomadic incursions, the Huns and others, destabilizing both Persia and the Eastern Roman Empire.
These migrations were a constant source of disruption.
Constantinople even had to build these massive defensive walls to protect itself.
It was a turbulent period with empires constantly under threat.
But in the midst of all this chaos, the early Christian church in Persia was trying to establish its independence from the West.
You see this in the agreements made at Seleucia to Ctesiphon.
It's like they were forging their own path separate from Rome.
And the reach of this church into Asia is amazing.
Right, there were major Christian centers in Asia centuries before many parts of Europe.
It's one of those forgotten histories that really challenges our assumptions.
But of course, there was pushback from the Zoroastrian priesthood.
They weren't going to just sit back and watch their influence decline.
And you have these fascinating conversion stories like that of Karda,
Where he's executed for converting to Christianity, and his own father throws the first stone.
It's a reminder of the personal sacrifices involved in these religious shifts.
And the constant tensions between different faiths.
And then you have the alliances constantly shifting.
It's like a geopolitical chess game.
Right, like the Eastern Roman Empire teams up with the Turks against Persia.
But then that alliance falls apart because the Romans aren't seen as reliable partners.
Yeah, talk about realpolitik.
It was all about strategic advantage and short-term gains.
And then in the early 7th century, you have these brutal wars between Persia and the Eastern Roman Empire.
They dragged on for years and devastated both empires.
And then there's this symbolic moment when the Persians capture the sacred fire from the Romans.
It was a major blow to Roman morale.
And it shows you just how intense this rivalry was.
And it's right at this moment of weakness for both empires that a new force emerges.
Islam.
And it spreads rapidly out of Arabia.
And at first, there's this interesting period of coexistence with other faiths.
Especially with Judaism.
Yeah, the sources mention these early agreements in Medina, emphasizing mutual defense and respect.
It's a reminder that early Islamic society wasn't always about conflict and conquest.
They were trying to build a stable and inclusive community.
And those agreements reflect that.
And under the early Islamic caliphates, you see this incredible flourishing of trade and intellectual life.
The Islamic world became this center of learning and commerce.
Yeah, you have wealthy ports like Saraf, massive caravans moving along land routes, boosting local production.
And this huge translation movement in Baghdad, where Greek, Persian, and Syriac texts are being translated into Arabic.
It was a golden age of scholarship and cultural exchange.
And the Islamic world was open to knowledge from other cultures.
They preserved and built upon the intellectual heritage of earlier civilizations.
And that's a key part of their success.
And the interaction with the nomadic world continues under Islam, right?
Yeah, the faith spreads among Turkic tribes, although sometimes it's more of a superficial conversion.
But towns near the steppes like Merv and Ray, they really benefit from this trade with the nomads.
Proximity to the steppes remained a key factor in economic prosperity.
And groups like the Khazars become strategically important.
Right, they act as a buffer between the Byzantines and Islamic empires.
And their conversion to Judaism is fascinating.
It was a strategic decision that allowed them to maintain a degree of independence.
And they were trading with both sides. Byzantine, silk, Islamic silver.
They were masters of playing both sides.
And then you have the Viking Roses.
Oh yeah, they were heavily involved in trade with the Islamic world.
The sources talk about this massive influx of Islamic silver coins into northern Europe.
It shows you how far-reaching these trade networks were.
But there was also a darker side to this trade, right?
Slavery.
Yeah, the Roses were heavily involved in the slave trade.
It was a brutal but profitable business.
But eventually, the Abbasid Caliphate starts to decline, and the Roses shift their focus towards the Byzantine Empire.
They even launched raids on Constantinople.
It shows you how the balance of power was shifting.
And the trade routes were changing too.
Byzantium itself experiences a revival during this period.
Right, as Baghdad's influence wanes, Constantinople becomes this center of economic and cultural activity.
They even established trade links with the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt.
It's like this constant ebb and flow of power and influence.
And for Western Europeans, pilgrimage to Jerusalem becomes increasingly important.
Yeah, it raises their awareness of the East.
And they're exposed to all the wealth and splendor of Byzantine religious relics.
It's like their world is starting to expand eastward again.
And new powers are rising too, like the Seljuks.
And the Italian city-states are starting to get really interested in trade with the East.
Places like Amalfi, Genoa, Pisa, Venice.
They see the potential for profit in these Eastern markets.
And then the Crusades happen.
Which were motivated by a mix of religious zeal and economic ambition.
Right. The Byzantine Empire appeals for help against the Seljuks, and the Pope calls for a holy war.
But the Italian city-states see an opportunity to secure trading privileges in the East.
And they used their naval power to support the Crusades in exchange for those concessions.
It's a classic example of realpolitik.
And the competition between these Italian cities is fierce.
They're all vying for dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean.
It's like a trade war playing out alongside the religious conflict,
And then you have the Mongol conquests.
which were initially incredibly disruptive.
I mean, they caused chaos and destruction across Eurasia.
But once the Mongols established their empire, they actually facilitated trade in some ways.
Yeah, they unified these vast territories, which made it easier for goods and people to move around.
And their fiscal policies were relatively favorable to merchants.
They kept taxes low, which encouraged trade,
And maritime trade also flourishes under Mongol rule.
especially in the Persian Gulf and China.
Guangzhou becomes this bustling international port.
It shows how different parts of the Silk Road network were thriving at different times.
But then the Black Death hits.
And it has a devastating impact on trade and travel.
It disrupts those interconnected networks and leads to widespread death and economic hardship.
And it contributes to the decline of the Silk Road,
And then Timurus comes along.
trying to revive Silk Road cities like Samarkand.
He invests heavily in infrastructure and tries to restore the Silk Road's former glory.
But it's a fleeting moment of resurgence,
And the Silk Road ultimately fades into relative decline.
overshadowed by the rise of maritime trade and the Industrial Revolution.
But those trans-Saharan trade routes and the wealth of places like Timbuktu, they remind us that this interconnectedness wasn't just an East-West thing.
It was a global phenomenon.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how the Silk Road thrived for centuries, this vital artery connecting East and West.
Its prosperity was built on its strategic location and all those supporting conditions we've discussed.
But then things start to change.
The age of exploration.
Columbus, Vasco da Gama.
These maritime expeditions completely transformed the global trade landscape.
And suddenly, Western Europe, which had been this relative backwater, is thrust into the center of this new global system.
It's a dramatic shift in power and influence.
And the focus of trade shifts from land to sea.
The Silk Road becomes less important as these new maritime routes open up.
And the European powers that control those sea lanes, they become the dominant players.
They establish colonies, they amass wealth, they build empires.
And the Industrial Revolution just accelerates this process.
Maritime trade becomes even more essential for moving raw materials and finished goods.
And the Ottoman Empire, which controlled much of the old Silk Road territory, it's facing its own challenges and its expansion slows down.
It's no longer the major player it once was.
And China, despite some signs of maritime interest, largely takes a more inward-looking approach during this period.
Partly due to European naval superiority in conflicts in East Asia.
And Russia's expansion across Central Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries, it does follow some of those old Silk Road routes.
But it's driven by imperial ambitions, not the traditional East-West trade dynamic.
It's all about the great game with Britain.
This competition for territory and influence.
And then the construction of railways in Russia further diminishes the importance of those old land routes.
It's a new era of transportation,
And the final blow is the completion of the Suez Canal.
which makes maritime trade even faster and more efficient.
The Silk Road is effectively bypassed.
And it falls into relative decline for centuries.
But now the sources are suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the Silk Road is experiencing a renaissance.
It's an intriguing idea.
This idea that in a world that's becoming increasingly fragmented and tense, those land-based connections might be more important than ever.
It's about security and stability.
The sources point to this massive gas pipeline deal between Russia and China as a prime example.
It's like a modern-day Silk Road.
China gets the energy it needs, and Russia gets an alternative market, bypassing some of the Western pressure.
And there are other examples too, right? These new infrastructure projects like the Belt and Road Initiative.
It's all about reconnecting East and West through land-based routes.
And it's not just about energy. It's about the economic potential of all those regions along the historical Silk Road.
The resources, the strategic locations.
There's a growing realization that these areas have a lot to offer.
And the sources also make this connection back to the historical role of the Silk Road as a conduit for ideas and cultural exchange.
It's not just about trade. It's about fostering connections between different civilizations.
And in a world where maritime trade is vulnerable to all sorts of disruptions,
Choke points, piracy, international conflicts.
these secure and efficient land-based routes might start to look a lot more appealing.
It's about hedging your bets, diversifying your options.
So the big question is, could these historical forces that once made the Silk Road so vital reassert themselves in the 21st century?
It's a fascinating thought.
And if so, what might the consequences be?
It could reshape the global landscape in ways we can't even imagine.
So this deep dive has really given us a lot to think about.
It's challenged our assumptions about the past.
And it's made us think about the future in a whole new way.
The Silk Road isn't just a historical footnote. It's a story that's still being written.
And it makes you wonder what other historical patterns might be reemerging in our own time.
It's a reminder that the past is never truly over.
It shapes the present and influences the future.
And the Silk Road is a powerful example of that.
So thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Until next time.
Stay curious.